Wichita police get national attention after the fake report of a homicide and hostage situation has deadly consequences. An officer mistakenly shoots an innocent, unarmed man. Now the police department faces outrage, and there are calls for better training and legislation to prevent this from happening again. It's just one of the big issues facing the Kansas legislature in the upcoming session. We're focusing on them: school funding, sexual harassment, can carrying, gun safety, some of the other hot topics. We'll talk about all of it with Kansas lawmakers and journalists covering these big stories right now on Kansas Week. The family of a man shot by a Wichita police officer joins a chorus of others demanding answers and accountability. Thanks for joining us. I'm Pilar Pedraza. We start with this story that has dominated the headlines across the state for several days now. On the evening of December 28th, Wichita police responded to the report of a homicide and hostage situation at a home in southwest Wichita. This police body cam video shows one angle of what happened. Police say 28-year-old Andrew Finch was ordered out of the house with his hands up. He complied and then, for some reason, lowered his arms for a moment. An officer reacted by shooting and killing Finch. It quickly became apparent there was no homicide or hostage situation. This fatal shooting was the result of a bogus report made by a man from Los Angeles, Tyler Barris, who now faces charges here in Kansas. But what about the officer who fired the shot? What about police accountability and preventing this from ever happening again? These are just some of the questions that we're here to discuss today. Joining me, we have Dr. Neil Allen from Wichita State University and Craig Andrus from KSNW News here in the city. And let's start with the legal aspect. Almost immediately, there's talk of legislation to change laws. Is this just a knee-jerk reaction, or are there laws that do need to be changed in this case?
Well, this is clearly a case where you have a technological innovation, in this case, I guess a couple of them. One, the telephone, which we've long had with long distance calling, which is of course now cheaper and so in effect more free for most of us. So if you go 20 years ago, probably somebody in LA would have actually been paying to make this bogus call. And the other one is also online video gaming, which leads to all kinds of extreme behavior for people. And so it makes sense then to think about whether our legislation can cover such situations.
And Craig, you and I were talking about earlier that while technology has changed, training hasn't really changed recently.
You know, they have really stayed the course on training. The Wichita Police Department and their officers do go through a rigorous training session. It is months and months, and that has not changed. Now, a lot of people have been asking the question and emailing us and asking us and even making phone calls, picking up and dialing and asking, what is the police training all about? Well, we're working on some stories at our station to talk about the training and what all involves. But right now, there is no call from the police chief, Gordon Ramsay, here in Wichita to change any of the training. They go through that training, and there's a reason that they go through all these different protocols that they go through. And that does include scenarios, people with guns, and how to deal with somebody, and how to deal with a SWAT type situation. Now, SWAT was not on the scene in this particular case, but the officer had been, on the force for 5 years, clearly had been trained. Talking about legislation, I had talked to Senator Jerry Moran, U.S. Senator. I talked to him just yesterday, and I asked him, is there going to be a look into some of the laws? Could we see some changes in the law here? And he said, well, Craig, clearly we need to look at this. We're into something new here since technology is rapidly changing, and since we've never heard, he told me, he said, Craig, I've never heard of swatting before, and honestly, I hadn't either. A lot of us had not, but at this point now, we all know what it is, unfortunately, after this horrific thing that happened. So, even Senator Moran is saying in Washington, look, we'll look into it. We need to have an appropriate response for something like this that happens, because the question now is, what will this person ultimately be charged with? And if he is charged with a certain crime and it is making a false report, at this point, I'm told that may be the charge, then what kind of a sentence does that carry? And does it really have any teeth to prevent somebody from doing this again?
Well, my understanding is the same as yours, that is probably the charge at this point, at least the one that he's being extradited on, a low-level felony. Are there other charges out there? You and I certainly have spent a lot of time covering courts. Not sure your experience with the law as far as criminal law, but are there other charges out there that might fit this? That, because I know in other cases, like with in other cases out there where technology has outstripped the law, they found old laws and made a way to apply them.
Well, the question here would be something like a manslaughter charge. And the question in that kind of area is, can you establish any kind of responsibility? And so this, in some ways, is like a situation where someone is driving erratically, and while they're not intending to kill a person, they jump up on the sidewalk and kill someone. And so we have some patterns of actually attributing responsibility to people for actions that they don't intend to cause harm or kill somebody, but they can foresee that. And you could argue that if someone makes a report of a hostage situation at a house, knowing that there are situations where loss of life occurs because of that, then there could be responsibility. But that's a really tricky sort of thing to figure out, especially when you're talking about, in effect, the worst kind of prank call here.
And this really was, I've heard it called the worst kind of prank call. Talking to several different attorneys about this situation, excuse me, voluntary manslaughter could be one, involuntary manslaughter if you want to back that down a little bit. But truly, the attorneys here that are involved, everybody from the family to others that I've talked to, are all saying this is one of those situations where people who may be making these calls, they're going to know that a situation could quickly and easily turn violent. So there needs to be an appropriate response. What are some of those measures out there? Well, yeah, of course that couldn't have, I'm probably not going to see a murder charge here. That's just a little bit outside the realm from what district attorneys have shown us in the past throughout Kansas and the Midwest as well. But certainly a voluntary manslaughter charge, if it's not stepped down to involuntary, there could be. And there could be other charges as well. We don't know what those will be, but some interstate rules because of the telephone use and some other things. There could be some serious prison time, excuse me, prison time, not just jail time, but could be some serious prison time here if there is charges filed and then a conviction.
But also, though, when you think about this philosophically, that it's a troubling sort of idea when you think that someone should, the argument is they should understand that by getting the police to somebody's house in a certain situation, that there is some likelihood of death in that situation. So that also says something really troubling about police individual interactions. And it might also have to do with just the fact that the police are dealing with extremely difficult situations where we know there are occasions where people will shoot from houses at police.
Yeah. Well, look at Denver. The day after the swatting incident here, they had the incident in Denver where several officers injured, one killed.
And so, and also in Wichita, I mean, Wichita, we have all the good and all the bad and all the in-betweens of being in a major metropolitan area. And so it in some ways is a more extreme version because the victim in this case had absolutely no responsibility or role in the situation. But also, though, if I'm in my house and the police come banging on my door because they got the address wrong, which has happened every once in a while, then what am I really supposed to do? I mean, and I think what I would do personally is I get down on the ground and stay there.
I explain this through the eyes of a 15-year-old or to the eyes of a 15-year-old. I'll go back to my sons and I tell them, they've asked about this specific situation. Dad, what would you do? And I make it very simple and very clear cut. I say, guys, if an officer asks you to do something and if an officer is pointing a gun at you and asks you to do something, guess what? It's probably a good idea to do that because officers, I tell them also, they're not RoboCop. They're not machines, they're people, and they either go home at the end of the day or they don't go home at the end of the day. I'm not a law enforcement officer. I don't have one in my immediate family, but I have some in my extended family. So I will say this, cops have to go home at the end of the day, and if they feel like potentially somebody's life is being threatened or their partner's life is being threatened, they may act on that given situation.
Looking at the legislative aspect of this, we all know this next session is going to be a doozy. It's an election year, we've got school funding, you've got who knows how many other major issues that are coming down the pike that lawmakers are going to have to deal with when they would rather not deal with any controversial issues this year. Is this kind of their, if they can pass some sort of law, kind of their feel-good issue that they can campaign on?
I would, if I were a legislator, I would probably stay as far away as I could from this right now.
Really?
Partly because there's all kinds of free speech issues here that also, if you're talking about Topeka, they have so many other issues to deal with. and and a lot might depend on where police departments are. So if the police unions and the prosecutors associations will come down hard on one particular way to deal with this, it's one thing. But if they don't do that, because it's such a complicated issue, because it could end up criminalizing unintentionally and giving huge penalties for somebody that mistakes on a call. So if I see my neighbor and is having some kind of distress, they're having some problems with their teenage child, and I misinterpret that and I call, and then the police come and there's a fatality involved, then am I going to be up for manslaughter? And so there's a lot of complications here, and it's the kind of issue that really dealing with it right in the aftermath is not the best way to legislate. Not to say that legislators don't do stuff like that.
We all know they do.
They do, and there might be some debate on that. I don't know. I tend to agree with you. I don't know that we're going to see something passed this time. It is a feel-good piece of legislation that could be introduced to try and say, let's do something to stop something like this from ever happening again. But the question arises, there is some free speech involved here, certainly. There are also some other laws involved that are currently on the books, and you can't just blanket something and say, this is the law now, and what are the consequences then if you pass that? You bring up a very good point. They do have a lot of things to take care of in Topeka.
Very much. And some major issues with all those things they've got to deal with. The Gordian knot of this session will be a state Supreme Court order that means lawmakers have to find hundreds of millions more dollars for public schools. I spoke with several lawmakers before the Christmas break about this and other issues they'll be facing.
We heard evidence about what 18% across the board cuts would do to programs, which is devastating. We looked at what taxes would have to be, but I think on both of those we were presented with evidence that were the extreme. I think there's somewhere in the middle.
You know, revenue is finally coming in, but we have a lot of other agencies that have a great deal of need. So you weigh that, all of that with some folks saying that we need to change our Constitution.
This might not be the answer for this year exactly, but I do think we need to come up with a solution so that this unending litigation by unelected justices doesn't keep going on and on and on.
Speaking to other states, I find that they don't have the word suitable. And they said that it's kind of a waste of our time to take it out because they don't have the word in there, but they still have lawsuits.
There are some tenured legislators that they won't touch a constitutional amendment. They will not vote on it.
Now, this is an issue that really is three issues in one. First, we got to find the money. Finding the money, either cuts or tax hike. And then the question of, we've had this raised, do we just ignore the courts? Senator Susan Wagle, shortly after this ruling came down, warning that we face a constitutional crisis, possible constitutional amendment. How big of a deal is this? How difficult is this session really going to be?
You really can't overestimate how difficult it is. Unless for some reason revenue comes in so high, and it is coming in higher than expected, that it solves this problem for the state. But what makes it particularly difficult is we have a different legislature than we did when this all started, or the most recent part of it started 3, 4, 5 years ago, because the moderate and Democratic victories in 2016 mean that the current legislature, at least the state house, probably isn't willing to actually put forward an amendment to change this, the Constitution and pull out the suitability language. And also, if that is raised, then you'll have Democratic candidates for governor who are in the House and the Senate, Jim Ward and Laura Kelly, then trying to make this about education funding, where the conservative Republicans seem to be losing now. And so it's quite a mess.
There certainly will be something changed with education funding. We know that based on past experience, they're going to probably come up with a combination of some things. There just wasn't the will in the Senate to look at all those different appropriations. You know, the money coming out of appropriations in the Senate probably there were some last-minute deals that were made finally between Republicans and Democrats. But look, we do have some major changes that have happened here in the House, but the House still remains very much fractured. And I'm not talking about the Democrat side right now. I'm talking about the Republicans in the House.
There's at least 3 parties amongst the Republicans themselves.
I would argue there's at least a 4th there, because you've got some folks that would call themselves common sense. You've got some true conservatives, and they would call themselves conservatives, moderates, and then you would call some that would call themselves the extremists, who say, we want change just for the sake of change. Now, that's not a big group, but you look at the Hutton group from a few years back in 2012, that was the sticking point on, do we get more taxes? Do we find some more funding for schools? So there remains no will right now in the House to get new taxes on the board. And on the Senate appropriations, it's not there also. So the question comes up, now what do we do? Do we come up with some cuts, and where do we find those cuts? It's going to be a tough beginning to this, and I don't know that they'll get to it right away. I think they may try and wait to see what House leadership is going to do, see what Susan Wagle is going to do with the leadership over there, and see what kind of a compromise there might be, because there wasn't a compromise until the 11th hour last year. There wasn't a compromise until the 11th hour, well, I will even say the 12th hour in the record-setting session the year before that. So it may be a while before they even get to this. And you're right, I don't think you can overestimate how difficult this is really going to be.
And there, I think the most likely scenario seems to be that if the court seems to be asking for $600 million, to come up with something less, to come up some of it through cuts, some of it might come through increasing revenue, particularly if there are even more of these basic of entities and people that are basically wage earners that have reincorporated to get out of the tax code previously and now are going to be back in. So you do a combination of things, and you see if the court will accept $300 million or something like that.
And that may be the jumping off point, because the change in the tax code, we've heard that from Republicans on both sides in the Senate and the House, and all stripes of Republicans in the House. We've heard that. Let's put something together here that could be a compromise. But the other question remains here too, is if we don't strike a compromise, do we ignore the courts? And there's no will, at least in the Senate, to do that right now. The House, maybe.
Yeah.
You can flip a coin on that.
The question I think in that is not so much is there the will, meaning are there enough votes to do it, but are there enough votes to keep anything else from happening?
Well, but also we should remember that the state Supreme Court doesn't have a police force.
Yeah.
They can order that schools close. But if they order schools closed July 1, it's not clear how that's going to turn out. There'll be all kinds of nasty backlash, particularly from parents like me who have children in public school.
Mine graduates this year, so I'm good.
My kids are in public school right now too, and I can tell you that thought rings hard and heavy every time you hear that. Well, what does that mean?
Yep.
How soon is it going to happen? What does it mean for school funding down the road?
Yep.
So could we be in a true constitutional crisis mode? I've heard that mentioned several times. I believe we're going to go down that road. It's going to be interesting to see how soon the courts jump in on this. They've given a framework, a basic framework.
Much tighter time framework than we've ever seen before.
It is.
But I think the best way to understand the state Supreme Court on this issue is that they're really policy actors. And they're doing so through a constitutional framework and using language that is in the Constitution, but they're policy actors that seem to be wanting to push us to more school funding. And so they've actually gotten a lot of what they've tried to get. And if they spark a backlash against courts in general, then they probably are going to set that policy goal back for quite a while.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we'll have to find out what happens there. And other issues that we'll be facing, from Washington, D.C. to Hollywood and then Topeka, allegations of sexual harassment and assault. Now, calls from the Senate President in Kansas and the Women's Foundation in Kansas City calling for updated policies. Some even want new laws.
I think that core values and personal ethics is something that we've kind of lost sight of as a society.
I do think that maybe some education would be helpful. It would certainly not hurt.
We're going to be looking at something. I think we need, as opposed to a policy, we need a law.
You don't make a joke at someone else's expense, and you don't wield power over someone who's more vulnerable. And those things that we know are true, we need to hold people to a high standard about those.
We had a retreat with the Democrats last week, and we were went through 2 hours worth of training. And, you know, it's good. We need to do that. I think all legislators need to be trained in that. You know, it forced me to look at, you know, past behaviors, not that I feel like I've done anything wrong, but just, you know, how I phrase things, what I might have said, been insensitive, and it causes you to think about that and look at it a little more seriously.
Now, this is perhaps an issue that lawmakers would rather not deal with, much like school funding, but they're having no choice, and we're seeing some very definite proactive action suggestions being made already. Is this going to reach the point of law, though, or is this going to remain kind of a policy issue?
Well, also something we have to remember here is that legislators are different than most employees, because if they have a boss, that boss is us, the voters. And so it's complicated how to enforce responsibility. Now, the thing that would make the most sense is to treat them like employees at any kind of professional workplace and to have an HR system and an HR department. But that doesn't fit real well with how legislators work. And so, and also you got to remember that the people that are making these rules are people that may themselves have had problems in the past, or almost certainly they will have allies and friends who have had problems in the past. And so constructing some kind of system will be difficult, although in this current climate it's hard to imagine not having at least changes in policy, if not change in law.
It would occur to me that perhaps it could be fairly quickly and easily done. If we turn to common sense would dictate there are certain things you just can't do. There are certain behaviors you're not supposed to do. We all learned these as children, and you're just not supposed to do them. So are we at a point now where maybe we do get an HR set up in the State House? Maybe we are. Pilar, you've spent a lot of time in the State House, as much as I have, and that's a lot, waiting for lawmakers to come up with things for weeks at a time. And are we at a point now where we do need an HR policy? We just implement it, we make it simple, we say these are the rules, and if you break these rules, you're subject to censure or whatever else may be.
And that does kind of sound a little bit like what I've heard from the proposals from Susan Wagle and from the Women's Foundation.
Well, and also that one positive for there being change is the fact that Susan Wagle is not just a long-time serving female legislator, but she is also not going to run for re-election. No. And so you have somebody with real power who also doesn't have the same kind of incentives that are constraining her behavior. In particular, that she can probably act in ways that discomfort her colleagues in a way that's harder for people that are going to run for a re-election.
All right. Well, there are many issues that are easy to foresee. Others, though, seem to always pop up out of nowhere every legislative section. I asked these lawmakers what other issues they thought might become a big deal this year.
Some CAN-CARE reform. We are looking at either an extension or new contracts with our CAN-CARE providers.
Making sure that families have the ability to choose the right kind of education for their students. For instance, children with dyslexia are not provided the services that might be most beneficial to them in the public school.
I am concerned at the amount of bundling that we do.
As we journey down this road about how do we help kids have a good education, you know, we need to talk about those wraparounds, whether it's mental health, whether it's counselors, or whether it's, you know, just making sure that there's the right pre-K program that helps kids be ready for schools.
I know that there's some perhaps legislation coming up dealing with concealed carry. That's going to be another big topic.
And guns are always a big deal in Kansas and a big topic, certainly. I know there's also another bill that's already been pre-introduced to make it a crime to abandon a weapon. We've had that happen at the State House, at KU. So that's of concern for some folks.
It's been a concern for a long time for a lot of lawmakers, and understandably so. We've had so many high-profile shootings. We've had so many high-profile problems and issues with guns. Look, Kansas is a pro-gun state. Make no mistake about it. Whatever side you're on, Kansas is a pro-gun state. And a lot of the lawmakers fall into that category, but they also fall into the category of what people on the other side of the argument would call common sense. So I do think we'll see something change with the gun laws here, and certainly with a lot of questions about guns on campus. There's been, I've done so many stories.
I've lost count of the number of stories, and I have been doing them for a few
stories
months.
on guns on campus, and there is some real disconcerting issues here with having guns on campus.
Well, but I think when you take a look at the legislature, the starting assumption should be for anything except for school finance, it won't happen. and unless you have a pressing need for it to happen. And also on school finance, things probably aren't going to happen quick, because it makes sense for pretty much everybody in this situation to wait until tax filings come in April.
Yeah.
And so, and because there's going to be some people that are hoping that economic growth bails them out.
Except they wait for those tax filings and they're going to miss the deadline with the Supreme Court.
Well, I would say that for the Supreme Court's deadline of I believe it's April 1st, you could make a lot of money betting on that being pushed. Now, whether you're going to push all the way to force the Supreme Court to actually make good on their closing schools in the summer deadline, that's much more complicated.
Now, I want to talk can care real quick because we're running out of time, and that was brought up as well. And certainly, I think we've all had contacts with folks who've struggled with can care. There are definite problems in the system. Does that one maybe break the no changes rule this year?
Possibly, although when you think about it, the governor's race complicates everything, because it's hard to imagine a bill coming out on can care that can override a veto. Jeff Collier might be the governor. If he's not, it's Governor Brownback, who clearly wants to protect the current can care system. Mm-hmm. And on the Democratic side, you have now a new candidate in Laura Kelly coming out of the Senate. You got Jim Ward in the House, and their incentives are all to push their narrative of complete government failure on issues of can care. So it's just not a recipe for compromise.
It doesn't appear to be, and I will say this, Jeff Collier's probably going to be the wild card here if he kind of remains governor, so to speak. That might be the point of compromise. I've had several discussions with him. He might be open to that.
But that'll be something we're going to have to wait and see.
Yeah.
And we are definitely going to have to wait because we're out of time to talk about it tonight. I thank you guys so much again, Dr. Neil Allen and Craig Andrus, for joining me. And I hope to see you here again real soon. And I hope to see you as well. If you'd like to talk more about what to expect this legislative session, feel free to find Craig or myself on Twitter. Look for the hashtag KSLeg for all the latest. For now, have a great week.